What you saw in that committee hearing yesterday, did that answer in any way your disbelief at the time when you broke the story?
Not particularly, Kate. I mean, I think anybody watching that committee will have emerged from it the view relatively unchanged. Either you think that Boris Johnson has done nothing wrong and still think that, or you think that he, like the majority of the population, you think that he broke the rules and knew about it when he addressed Parliament. And you still think that now. What I did see, though, was somebody who went into the committee who I expected to be cool, to stick to their script, to be pretty calm. We've been told he'd been very well briefed. And then as the committee progressed, that sort of unravelled and he became tetchy, he became quite cross. And towards the end, there was some quite direct attacks on the integrity of the committee itself. I noticed his chief lawyer, Lord Pannick, behind him, raising his eyebrows and shaking his head slightly when he suggested that the best way for the committee to prove its fairness was to exonerate him. And really some of his key arguments, briefly, is the assurances that he says that he got from staff that no rules or laws or guidance was broken in Number 10 during the pandemic with his lockdown gatherings. The fact that he felt those leaving dues and other gatherings were strictly necessary, and a sort of a rewriting of the rules, if you like, the mitigations that existed at the time. Or each of those three elements showed that I think that his central defence unravelled.
Salia, you represent, in the worst possible way, the people who feel so personally devastated by going through, following the rules, being on the front line as your family was, and losing your father to COVID-19. Nothing's going to bring your father back. Nothing is going to get the moments back that you couldn't have. But did anything yesterday make you feel answered? Did your frustration ease? What were your thoughts?
I think for me personally, this will only come to an end when we get the right conclusion from the Select Committee, which is that Boris Johnson should no longer be able to participate in politics in the UK, that he has made his position untenable in that domain. I mean, I think this is a classic example of when you tell one lie, you have to keep lying to keep covering up the original one. I mean, I think yesterday as I was watching, and I watched the whole thing, side by side, I was having flashbacks to what I was doing during that time. All those dates that were brought up, December the 18th, January, early January, all those events, the garden party in the summer. I have recollections of what I was doing at that time. And that was working with dedicated frontline healthcare workers trying to save people's lives. And when we had the garden party, we didn't have a vaccine at that point. We were so vulnerable with what we were doing. I recall having to break bad news to the loved ones of patients who were dying. I particularly remember young patients with families, with children who were desperately trying to call everyone before they were sedated and made to go to sleep whilst we cared for them, never to wake up again. That's what I was remembering as Boris Johnson tried to twist around with the semantics of whether he intentionally or unintentionally misled Parliament. The bottom line is he broke the rules, his own rules.
Lorne Greenhouse, when you hear Salia speak so eloquently and powerfully there from personal experience and professional experience, as well as a doctor on the front line and having to break the news to families who were losing their loved ones and couldn't be with them, you can understand why this is such a passionate subject for so many of our viewers and so many people. What was your take on Boris Johnson yesterday? You've been a long-standing supporter of his. Do you think that he sort of performed well? Do you think he's going to come out of this OK? Or will the committee find what Salia certainly hopes, that he has misled Parliament?
Well, can I just say that I empathise entirely with Salia, because you mentioned I lost my own mother to COVID in the first wave, and I wasn't able to be with her when she died, like many people in that first wave. It was brutal. And in fact, my father worked all his life in the NHS, and the person he trained in Franklin, the last thing we know is that he gave her an ice cream the day before she died, before she was no longer rousable. So it was a very brutal COVID for my family as well. And I empathise entirely with those people who lost loved ones. It's an unprecedented pandemic. What I've got to say is yesterday was not about Partygate, and Boris started his evidence by saying he regretted the events that took place in Number 10. Deep regret. I think that was in his opening statement. What yesterday was about was whether the former Prime Minister knowingly misled Parliament. And there's nothing in the evidence that I can see after 3.5 hours of cross-questioning, which I think he did very well in, and a 10-month investigation, a police investigation, and the Sue Gray report that he himself commissioned. There's nothing that can demonstrate that he knowingly misled Parliament. There is this new category of offence that's never been used before in the parliamentary setting of recklessly misleading. I asked the question of distinguished lawyers that understand Erskine May and parliamentary precedent, whether any parliamentarian has ever been essentially been sanctioned for recklessly misleading, and no one ever has. And I think it's an example, I think, of this committee somewhat changing the rules, and that is a great concern to me.
So, concerns about the committee, and I know that you've tweeted that you feel it's a kangaroo court as well, echoing what Jacob Rees-Mogg has said, and we'll talk about that with the others in a moment. But when you say that you lost your family members in that terrible way, as many thousands of others did, and then you heard Boris Johnson say, well, obviously, we couldn't reasonably social distance, and obviously, there were going to be situations, partly because of the construct of the building, he mentioned, where we couldn't follow the advice, the guidelines and the rules. I think many people would think, well, it was obvious that in a surgery, on a hospital ward, there were going to be challenges, but it was at the forefront of those doctors' minds to get around them. And I think whether or not he misled Parliament, it didn't feel like he got that point, which I think is at the core of people's distress.
Well, it's a difficult point to get across, but I spent all my life following my father around, because the only way I could spend any quality time with him, doing ward rounds with him on Christmas Day. And this is at Charing Cross Hospital, very close to where I am now. He spent his entire working life there. The ward rounds and the designs of hospitals are very different to a cramped Victorian building in Downing Street. But I think they did the best they could to socially distance and stay within the rules. Now, clearly, it is harder in that sort of environment. And I understand the point that the public don't expect the people that make the rules to break the rules, even if it's inadvertent. So I understand the concern that's out there. But this is about whether the former Prime Minister, and the sitting Prime Minister, actually, who was also sanctioned, by the way, the same fixed penalty notice, who issued the same responses to Parliament. This is about whether the former Prime Minister knowingly misled Parliament. And let's stick to what this yesterday was all about. And on that score, I simply don't think all the months of investigation and the hours of grilling have demonstrated that in any way or shape or form.
Let's put that to Pippa then, because Pippa, obviously, you've forensically been through this story right from the very beginning. Do you agree with Lord Greenhouse that there wasn't any evidence from what he could see yesterday that Boris Johnson recklessly or deliberately misled Parliament?
I think the word recklessly is key, because, as the committee said in its interim report, it should have been obvious to him, as the man that not just drew up the rules, but then stood behind that podium in Downing Street and told the rest of us to follow them, what the rules were. And I should be clear, they were talking not just about the laws, but the guidance. And Boris Johnson went to the Commons on multiple occasions and said that both the rules, the laws, and the guidance had been followed at all times at Number 10, when quite clearly from the evidence, that's the oral evidence, the written evidence, the pictures, and yesterday in the committee, that was not the case. He should have known. It wasn't up to advisors to point that out to him. He was the man that drew up the rules. And in fact, if you go through the evidence that was released by the committee yesterday morning before the hearing, the written evidence, several key advisors, including the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, including his PPS, his top civil servant in his office, Martin Reynolds, and his then Director of Communications, Jack Doyle, who cited throughout this evidence, all expressed some degree of reservation about whether they'd offered that advice. And in Simon Case's case, said no, he hadn't he hadn't at all and didn't know of anybody else. So I think the fact that he says that he was relying on assurances from the committee, and then secondly, the sort of the bit which really pushed the bounds of credulity for me, and I think for many, many other people, was this sort of rewriting of the rules. That these sorts of gatherings were within the rules at the time. They were not. There was no exemption for work socialising. And for Boris Johnson to suggest that they were a necessity, that saying goodbye to people to boost morale, well, show me any FTSE 200 company, hospital, work environment during that period where chief executives felt that it was essential to, in person, with alcohol and often all sorts of other sort of socialising accoutrements, to come in and boost morale by saying goodbye between 6 minutes and 25 minutes in one case. You won't find one. So I think it really stretches the bounds of credulity. And I think, as I said at the start, the people that went into this thinking, and that's the vast majority of people, by all the polling suggested about 3/4 of people thinking that Boris Johnson misled the House, emerged from it with the same impression. And most crucially, I think the committee did too.
Sally, do you feel that, bearing in mind, as Lord Greenhouse has pointed out, this is about whether he misled Parliament, not whether the behaviour at the time was right or not. Did you feel that there was enough evidence to think that he had, or are you just too, in a way, influenced by the tragedy of it all?
I mean, look, we've got incredible journalism. And I have to say thank you to Pippa for actually bringing this, the initial seeds of this to light. I think it's one of the most important stories of our time, really significant. I think, yes, there is evidence. I think what this has been a masterclass in has been seeing how to navigate around it. In this case, to save one's political career, and not actually in demonstrating good, decent leadership. I mean, I have been inside Number 10, and I can tell you there are spaces that are far bigger than what we were navigating within our hospital. If you work within a hospital, you'll be very well aware that the rooms that we sit in to have our coffee breaks, where we have our handovers, the doctor's rooms where we sit and write up case notes, are shoe boxes, and we had really strict guidelines on how many people could be in that space at one time, even down to how many people could sit down and have a coffee during their very sparse breaks that they had. The only time where we put that kind of distance into one side was when we were trying to save someone's life, or when we were crowded round a bed trying to prone a patient, that is a sedated patient, trying to turn them onto their front so they could breathe better. Those were the only times, those are the only exceptions to the rules that I could really feasibly understand. I mean, it made me remember the times that we stood in all the big supermarkets with people staffed to make sure that we were 2 meters apart. And if there was anywhere in the country that needed a morale boost, I would say it was the burnt out NHS workers on the front line, many of who are now taking sick leave to get over what they witnessed.
Lord Greenhouse, if we come to you for just one last question as well, there's still some question marks over whether Boris Johnson will accept the findings of the committee as well. We were talking earlier with some of our panellists saying that trust in politicians is at an all-time low. I wonder what sort of damage that would do to that trust if, after the findings of the committee and then the vote that potentially gets put to the House of Commons, if he were to ignore them or choose not to honour them, I wonder how much damage that would do.
Well, listen, he set out his position in an 80-page bundle of evidence, some of which I was able to read yesterday. I'm sure that the committee will reach its conclusion and decide whether or not to sanction the former Prime Minister. It's up to Boris how he responds to this. I personally think that he's set out that there's no way
should he
did
accept
he know
those findings,
though? And therefore the committee should be exonerating him. And I don't see why he should accept the findings of a politically charged committee if they haven't got the evidence to prove that he knowingly misled Parliament. And that is the burden of proof that is shown to be, in parliamentary precedent, that which you have to prove.
Pippa, what do you make of that Lord Greenhouse is saying he doesn't think he should have to accept it? Oh, you've got an invader in front of you.
Sorry about that, cat. Well, look, I think, as you rightly say, Ben, trust in Parliament and in politics in general is at an all-time low. And part of that is a result of Boris Johnson's administration. And I think for him to refuse to accept the findings, I mean, let's be clear, if the committee rules, then that process goes ahead. Everybody else will respect those findings. Then I think it would do two things. One, it would show him to be not necessarily the man of integrity and good faith that he would like us to believe he is. But secondly, it would show that he, I think, cares more about his own political future than he does about politics reputation in general. I think that'd be very damaging, and I suspect there'll be plenty of people, his friends and his allies, who, if it reaches that point, and obviously we've got some way to go before the committee makes up their mind, if it reaches that point, will be urging him to accept those findings with good grace.
OK. We're going to have to leave it there. We do appreciate you all joining us. Thank you, Pippa Creagh, Lord Greenhouse and Dr. Saliha Hassan. Thank you for joining us on the programme again.